Welcome to another episode of Start the Week with Wisdom. I'm your host, Bridget Burns with the University Innovation Alliance. This show is sponsored by Mainstay, which is a student engagement and retention platform that we've seen actually proven to work to improve student retention and outcomes at places like Georgia State and at other institutions. You're going to want to take a look at mainstay.com because you're going to find peer-reviewed research, which is one of the rarest things to have an ed tech company actually engage in that kind of scrutiny and subject themselves to outside eyes and then publish those results. And they do it all the time, and they've already proven that they can reduce summer melt by 21% at Georgia State. And in another independent study, they also helped them retain 1,200 students they would have otherwise lost. So check them out at mainstay.com. And the Innovating Together podcast is also sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who has always been a generous friend of ours. So Weekly Wisdom is a show that is uplifting, and I'm always, bringing someone on who is a leader in the field that I think that you would benefit from learning from. Someone who is not just a leader, but generous with their wisdom. And I can't think of a better description for who we're going to talk to today, which is my friend and soon to be yours, Eric Waldo, who is the president of the DC College Access Program. Formerly, he was the executive director of Reach Higher. He also worked directly in the White House. So he's like one of the biggest deals that any of us know, and worked directly with First Lady Michelle Obama for quite some time. So, Eric, thank you so much for making the time to be here with us.
Thank you, Bridget. It's really fun to be here with you.
I'm just so excited for folks to get to know you and to learn more about the incredible work that you've been leading. And I feel like I just want to start with like the career arc that you've had, because I actually don't know the answer to this. I have no idea how you ended up like getting to the White House, which I feel like it makes sense where you end up from there because you were, so effective at building community. I think that's a community builder and like invigorating energy source to a variety of topics. How'd you end up there? Like, tell me the Eric Waldo story.
Well, it's really funny you should ask because I joke that I'm not the person who actually, I wasn't someone who was trying to get to the White House my entire life, right? You meet so many people in Washington who, they're the White House intern, they were their class president, from 8th grade onward. That wasn't my journey. I was someone who really, in college, if you had met me, I was a comparative literature major. I was actually pre-med. I took the MCAT. I thought I was going to go to medical school. I'm one of 3 sons, and my dad's a doctor. And I was like the last hope because none of them became physicians. So I did all the classes. But my senior year, I actually decided after I took the MCAT, I'm like, you know what, I'm at least going to take a year up before medical school. And suddenly I didn't submit the things to the dean. And that freed me up. And I took a history of American education class with a professor named Carl Kasel. He used to run the education department at East Chicago. Then he was at Brown University when I met him. And I loved that class. And I was reading about, the founding of the Common School movement, education, all these great learnings of how we've been fighting about the value of education since our founding. And the TA in that class was a friend of mine. And I told her how I didn't know what I was going to do when I graduated. And she told me about a program called Summer Bridge, which is now called Breakthrough. And I became a team teacher of rising 7th and 8th grade students in Providence, Rhode Island. And that was my first taste into education. And after a little bit of a foray way down the path, I actually was briefly an actor. I had a headshot. I worked in the Berkshires, did a few plays here and there. I'll show you my headshot with a lot of curly hair.
You are blowing my mind right now.
Yeah,
this has been great.
This is real. So like I had a headshot. I was acting in the Berkshire Theater Festival at a children's theater. I did a musical in Boston while I had a temp job. And then 9/11 happened. And, I'm sitting there. I've got 8x10 glossy photos of myself that I'm using to go to auditions. And I honestly made a list of all the people I admired. I was having this existential crisis. And I called a friend of mine he was in med school. I was like, should I go back to med school? What should I do? And I made a list of the people I admired. And I realized that they all had something in common, which was education. Like the people I admired the most who changed my lives were educators. And I made a plan that night, which was I was going to get a master's in ed and go to law school and work in education policy. And I joked that I'm one of the few people in America who did the thing I said I wanted to do in my law school application essay. So I went to the ed school at Harvard. And during that time, I actually ended up volunteering on my first presidential campaign. It was an assignment that I did while I was at the Kennedy School to work. I was at the ed school, but I took a Kennedy School class, and I volunteered on the John Kerry campaign in 2003, started knocking on doors in New Hampshire on weekends with tough students. Then I got to Chicago Law School, and that's where I met Barack Obama. He was still teaching at Chicago at my first quarter there.
Oh, man.
And yeah, exactly. And, I ended up after law school clerking. And then when I saw that Barack Obama announced, I basically reached out to all my friends in Chicago, and I got hired to be an unpaid legal intern on the Obama campaign. So the joke that I tell people, right, is like, it's August, September 2007. And Barack Obama just had a terrible summer. He lost Hillary Clinton in all the debates. People were saying he was too professorial. And I go to interview to be the legal intern to work for the staff counsel, a lady named Kendall Berman. And it was just her. She was the one person, and she had outside staff, but like no one else was helping her. And I took this unpaid job. And when I did so, everyone thought I was crazy. I had turned down a 6-figure job in New York City at Latham & Watkins, a big law firm. I'd turned down a clerkship bonus to take this unpaid legal internship, to live on my friend's extra bedroom in Chicago. And I took this bet on Barack Obama because I believed in him. And that basically was my first step onto the Obama roller coaster and rocket ship. And so I get on there, and then I work on the campaign. I get hired on staff. Then on election night in Grant Park, I find out that I'm going to get a job on transition. I moved there a few days later and start vetting cabinet officials. And that's when I met Arne Duncan. And, all my friends were fighting to go to the White House, to Treasury, to HHS, where a lot of fun things were going to happen. And I was like, well, I taught, I care about education. This is what I want to do. And I got on Arne's confirmation team, and I told him about my story, and he's invited me to come over and work for him. And so I basically then spent the next 5 years working for Arne. I became the deputy chief of staff there. And honestly, I sort of learned, it was like my PhD in education. I learned so much about the intersection between federal government and local government in terms of education. And one of my jobs as deputy chief of staff was liaising with other agencies and with the White House. And so when Mrs. Obama's team called us after the re-elect in 2012, they said, hey, we've got this idea. We want Mrs. Obama to take on another initiative. We want to work on education. Will you help us? And so I actually worked with her for about a year, still at Ed, where we were workshopping ideas around what she could take on for a new initiative. And that became Reach Higher. And then she invited me to go work for her. And I then that became another, the final 3 years of the White House and another 7 years of my life working for her.
I love it. This is like, first off, it's just such a great story. I love, especially for young people to hear, because this idea that you have to have a direct path, is untrue. But also I love how you course corrected and you actually ended up having a very direct path. But just the weaving altogether is just really beautiful in retrospect. But it's so, it sucks that it always feels like chaos at the time, and it always feels so ambling. But looking back, it's just like, this is a very clear story. It makes so much sense based on who you are that you would do exactly this. Well, that's refreshing. And Arne Duncan, talk about one of the people who, it's rare to meet someone who's like a big deal legend who actually is like even better than you expect. And he is like, he was just, every time I interact with him, I'm like, man, you were just like such a strong like leader. Like you said, and he's also like a caretaker. I just ran into him in an event recently and what he's doing in Chicago. So like, he's such a heart-centered leader.
Yeah, Arne, really important person in my life, was a mentor, has become a friend. But yeah, the way he leads is extraordinary. He is a leader of character and strength and no ego, which is how he led, right? Our very first day in the office, and again, I got to be at Arne's confirmation hearing, but our first day at Ed, he put up one slide at an all-staff meeting in the LBJ auditorium at Department of Ed, and it said, just call me Arne. And that's real, right? I think in DC, there's a lot of trappings of, fancy buildings, lots of history, lots of titles. And he didn't want to be Mr. Secretary, right? He wanted to be Arne. And that's something that, Arne rarely pushes back on people around like those sorts of things. But if someone called Mr. Secretary, Arne, like he wanted to be Arne. And I think that very small code actually had a lot of power, both for our team, for DC, and the type of team we wanted to build, the ethos we were trying to create. and what it was about, right? It's not about us. It's not about our egos. It's about getting things done for students. And, Arne both lived that, but also, the other word I think about with Arne, in addition to being egoless and student-centered, is courage. And that was a word that we actually used a lot. I mean, we talked about it. Now in my nonprofit CEO mindset, I think about, courage as an explicit value that we would have on our website. That's one of the things we believe in. But Arne and our communications director, Peter Cunningham, who I think was a kind of Arne Duncan's David Axelrod, one of his storyteller, they talked a lot about courage. And, I do a little bit of impression of Peter, but Peter, guy from the Bronx, his dad was also a big Politico. And we would talk about something, and like the worst insult that Peter or Arne could give is like, he'd be like, Arne, not a lot of courage, Arne, not a lot of courage. Talking about someone else, right? Some other leader somewhere that they weren't showing courage. And so we talked about courage all the time, and that manifested in real life, right? It wasn't just, this fancy idea. And one just very specific example of courage that I was thinking about with Arne is he loved and embraced having difficult conversations with people who disagree with him. And a very specific example, I traveled the country with Arne many, many times over my years working for him. And we did an event in Seattle. I think it was probably like 2010, 2011. And, Arne has a security detail. We have an advanced team that goes to sites ahead of time. So we always know what's going on. We're in constant communication. And we knew that there were going to be protesters at this event at the school protesting Arne. And the first thing Arne said was, I want to meet with those protesters. I want to sit down with them. Like, let's invite them in. Like, I want to have a conversation. And I just want to say how rare that is in Washington, D.C. When people hear that there might be a protest or they may get booed, something may be scary, most people like, oh gosh, I'm going to run away from that. And that was another one of the things we talked about a lot was we talked about running to the fire, right? If something's scary, you don't want to hide your head. You don't want to say no comment. You want to run to the fire. You want to say, hey, I'm the first here and I'm going to show courage. I'm going to tell you what I think about it. I'm going to be authentic. And so at that event, we met offsite with those protesters, and I'll never forget it because Arne actually asked our security detail to leave the room. And so he's there and these people are probably, let's say 5 to 10, and a guy was standing up just like yelling at Arne, like full volume in a classroom, like, you're a privatizer and you're going to take away Title I, and, basically demonizing Arne. And Arne was just calm as could be. He's like, that's not true. Like, I don't know where you're getting that information. Like, we're not doing anything to do that. And again, like we think now today in the parlance of 2024 about misinformation or disinformation, there were a lot of funny things happening, early in the Obama administration around education, Common Core that brought together, I think, strange parts of the left and the right together, and a lot of, frankly, conspiracy theories about what was happening. And Arne was willing to talk to those folks, to listen, to be authentic, and then to invite them in, right? We had that conversation. He heard them out. He tried to address their concerns. And then he said, hey, let's come into this event. Judge me on what I do. And that was something I saw Arne do constantly, right? We had protesters that had, more than I like to share, and we'd invite them in and we'd sit down with them. And they were always shocked to meet him and to see him there in person, engaging with them as real people and not as caricatures.
Yeah, that's so refreshing. Well, I was going to ask you for leadership, wisdom that you've gleaned from others that you use on a regular basis. But I feel like you jumped straight to the best story ever. Is there any other, so I'm just curious about, you're a president of your own organization. I'd love to give you a chance to talk about it if you'd like. But everything that you've experienced has informed how you show up for your team. And I'm wondering if beyond Arne's example, are there other people or experiences that you think you catch yourself when you're in that leadership moment? That's kind of a hard moment where you're like, I know where, like, you're referencing someone else or some experience. What has been the thing that, or the person who's shaped your leadership style the most?
I do think it's probably Arne, just because I spent so much time in such close proximity. But I think I've been very lucky in my career to be exposed to some really extraordinary leaders. So, and I've actually been thinking about this a lot in my own leadership journey. And, I think Arne obviously had that courage conversation is the biggest thing I take from him, with courage and also sort of lack of ego. Like, he was someone who, he would bring young people to the table, right? It didn't matter what your title was, your position. Like, he didn't care at all about positional authority. It's like, well, Eric has a good idea. Like, he should be in this conversation. Doesn't matter what his title is. Sarah should be in this conversation. Brian, Hillary, Dan. And again, to me, it was counterfactual to a lot of DC. A lot of DC is like, what's your title? Where do you sit? Who sits next to whom? And Arne, and again, he actually just recently lost his mom, Sue Duncan, who ran the Sue Duncan Center in Chicago for generations. And she was a transformative leader. And I think that was his role model growing up. And what she did on the south side of Chicago, she ran an after-school program for kids who basically had been failed by the Chicago public education system. These are kids who couldn't read, who were kept being promoted through their grade level. And she'd take them after school. She'd give them apples, cheese, lunch, a safe place. And that program was also near peer based, right? It was students teaching students. So, the fifth graders taught the second graders and the ninth graders taught the fifth graders. And Arne literally grew up at that center his whole life and saw the power of that. And so I think, I've heard him tell these stories. And so I think that affected me too, where he realized that anyone can teach anyone. Like, wisdom is not just a one-way current of from down to below. It's also up, down, sideways, left, right. And so in my own leadership, I've recognized that, and I saw this also on the Obama campaign, frankly, in 2007, 2008, great ideas, if you can have distributed leadership, don't have to come from the top, right? It comes from anyone. And when you empower those leaders, when you give them the seat at the table, when you let them lead, that is really powerful. They feel ownership, great ideas surface, and it isn't just this, what I've maybe heard other leaders talk about, the hippo problem. The highest paid person in the organization is suddenly the only one who makes decisions or where ideas come from this mountaintop. And Arne very much was, no, like, we're going to ask, Justin, we're going to ask Sandra, we're going to ask all these people, and it doesn't matter where they sit. Let's give them the seat at the table, give them a voice. And I think that's because he saw the power of it, in his mom's program. And then he himself was like a young gun. I tease Arne now, he's got some gray hairs, but he was the CEO of Chicago Public Schools at 37, right? I think he saw the power of empowering young people, passing the baton, keeping, a really fresh mindset. Let me just add one other thing on leadership models. Working for Mrs. Obama so closely, obviously, it was a powerful experience as well. And she has many, many superpowers. I think she's one of the greatest storytellers, maybe of all time. But I think the secret to that storytelling was actually authenticity. I think that, when people ask me, like, what's the most important thing I learned about, storytelling or leadership, I think her superpower is authenticity, because when she was giving a speech or thinking about what she wanted to tell to a group of young people, a group of school counselors, a group of educators, her process was really detailed and thoughtful to say, what is a unique story that I have that these people might uniquely need or want to hear that could change their lives? And so she was willing to be vulnerable. She was willing to be authentic. She was willing to tell really hard and difficult stories about her own journey so that people could see themselves in her and grow. And I saw that most closely when we talk to young people directly, where, again, the first thing that happens is they think she's like Beyonce, right? It's like, oh my gosh, this beautiful, really, striking person has come into the room. And so they assume that it's impossible to be her. And then very quickly, Mrs. Obama would spend time to sit at a table around the group and share her story and talk about her own journey from the south side of Chicago. Parents didn't go to college, first gen, having to take a bus 2 different ways to get to her magnet school, being doubted by, her school counselor, who famously told her she wasn't Princeton material. So many people have the story of not feeling like they belong, what we call imposter syndrome. And I think when those students, there'd be this moment in the sitting down where they'd go from thinking, oh, this is like someone I can't even believe, a celebrity, to, wait a second, her story isn't that different from mine. And suddenly those students would tell their stories of, hey, I have to take care of my brothers and sisters. I have to do this extra job. I do X and Y. And they thought that those stories didn't matter. But then when they hear Michelle Obama talk about them, they suddenly realize, oh, those stories might mean that I'm stronger, that I have grit, that I have tenacity, that I have persistence. And you saw that unlock what they saw as their own growth mindset and potential. So I think her willingness to be authentic, her willingness to be vulnerable, her willingness to really meet people where they are is something I think about all the time. The last thing I'll say, I could go on for a while, but I do think a lot about kindness also in leadership. And I had the fortune, I left Mrs. Obama's team, the retired team, to jump back into the Biden administration for about 1.5 years. And I worked for Vivek Murthy, the U.S. Surgeon General. And
it's such a curveball. I love that you did that in the midst of everything.
It was taking a break from higher ed. I was like, it's a pandemic. I'd met Vivek, Dr. Murthy, years before, but then during transition, we got connected through a mutual friend, and I was just kind of giving lessons learned from working at the White House, because I thought the Surgeon General's office is actually a lot like the East Wing. It's a big bully pulpit, but not necessarily a lot of like grand authority, other traditional statutory authority. And we were thinking about how to use his bully pulpit. So he invited me to run his public engagement team, and that was such an honor. And Vivek is someone who thinks a lot about mental health, the mental health crisis across America. He put out a lot of great leadership and work and writings on that. But one of the things a value that he talked a lot about, and that, I think I thought about but hadn't really articulated explicitly, was kindness, right? And we are in such a difficult time, maybe overall in our country, in America. The world feels tough on a good day, that it's on fire. And we know everyone else has their own private struggles, right? I'm a dad. I've got a 2.5-year-old at home. I'm maybe not sleeping, or, I'm worried about my mom who's got Parkinson's. I'm mourning my dad who I lost last year. We're all complicated, multidimensional people. It's not just about, hey, what's that KPI I had at work, and did you not achieve it? We have to see people in their wholeness. And so we spent a lot of time in our mental health work thinking about this. And I think kindness was what I distilled from that, around wanting to create an environment that really tries to see people in their full selves and create a safe environment for people to work. And that kindness as a value that we explicitly state can help us not just get the work done, but get the work done in a way that the how we do the work is really important. And I think sometimes at other points in my career, I've worked with leaders who cared less about the how. And I think a lot about the how. And Vivek was someone who I think helped me really crystallize my thinking that the how is just as important as the what.
It's so great. And I was also going to ask you about the most surprising thing about your career. And I have to guess, is it that you just took a curveball break and shifted from education to healthcare? I bet you learned a lot and thought it sounds really refreshing to. I often think about that. I'm like, because I'm just very curious about other places and spaces and what it's like to operate in them, because I've lived in higher ed and worked in higher ed my whole career. And that had to be a steep learning curve, but so fun for that.
It was a total blast. I will say, I'm a fan of the opening lines of Anna Karenina, which says, every happy family is the same. Every unhappy family is unique in its unhappiness. And I'm not saying that it was an unhappy place, but I think federal agencies, bureaucracy, maybe are their own unique in their own unhappiness, but they're also pretty similar. So actually, I didn't realize it at the time, but having had an experience at education as the deputy chief of staff, then at the White House in a cross-functional role, I was like, I thought I had to learn a lot more. It was new relationships and new subject matter, but there was a lot of similarity in terms of navigating matrix organizations, hierarchy, egos. It actually brought me, in some ways, comfort of like, okay, like everyone's dysfunctional in the same way, whether it's the medical profession or the education profession. And I was like, okay, got it. Like dysfunctional adults, I know how to work with this.
So you have, you built and done and created all kinds of things. You've worked with the most incredible leaders that people reference who've never met them. People learn leadership from these people as just an idea, but the fact that you actually knew them personally is fantastic. But you've left your own indelible impression on the world. You've created things. Reach Higher was I know that you ran it for the First Lady, but I'm like, it had Eric Waldo in the DNA of it through and through, or has. And I'm just curious about, for you, if you look back at this stage of your career, what are you if there's one thing that you've done, what are you most proudest of?
Wow. It's tough. So one thing I will say, and maybe it's the through arc of what we're talking about here on the journey. And again, when I think about, I was talking about courage for Arne, authenticity for Mrs. Obama, kindness for Vivek Murthy. When I think about like maybe what are the Eric Waldo secrets of success, and therefore like, what's that through line? I think it's following passion over prestige. And this will sound funny from someone who's like worked at the White House or done some maybe what look like fancy things. But at different iterative moments in my career, I made choices that were about following my passion versus what I think a lot of other people thought would have been much more prestigious at the moment. And later, in hindsight, they look better. But that's only because I kept following my passion. And that meant that at these key inflection points, I'll mention it specifically, right? So, again, talking about leaving a federal clerkship and choosing to work on the Barack Obama campaign versus taking a big job at a fancy law firm. when I told one of a career clerk in Cleveland where I was working that that's what I was going to do on my last week, she'd taken me out to lunch. She's a seasoned career federal law clerk, worked for a judge in Cleveland. I told her I was going to go work on the Obama campaign, and she literally put her hand on my shoulder, and she said, "Okay, well, listen, let me know how that works out, and like, please call me if you need anything." But she thought I was insane, right? Like the physical and emotional sort of signs of her story were like, "Oh, like you've made a terrible decision." I called a cousin of mine who was a lawyer, my cousin Carlos, about 12, 15 years older than me, in Florida and Puerto Rico. And I called him and I said, "Carlos, here's what I'm thinking. I'm going to go work for the Obama campaign. This is why I want to do it. This is what I'm giving up." And I said, "Carlos," I was like, "no matter what, I'll be on the right side of history." Because at the time, it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to win, and people presumed she was going to get the nomination and win. And when I told Carlos this, "I'll be on the right side of history," he said, "Eric, history is written by the victors." And he did not mean that as a compliment. He meant like, "Hey, like if you lose, like no one's going to care what you did." So again, I mostly had people telling me not to do this, and I followed my passion, and that led me to a place where, again, finally when Barack Obama wins Iowa, wins the nomination, suddenly it's this, what a great bet you made. But I was sort of betting on my own passion. Similarly, I get to the transition at the White House, or during the transition team, and I'm vetting cabinet officials. I'm working with folks, and again, like people were like, "You should fight to get the White House. You got there so early on the campaign. What are you doing? That's the more prestigious thing. Go to the White House. Go to the Department of Defense. Go somewhere else." And I knew, like, I wanted to work for Arne. I wanted to work in education. That was my passion, as opposed to saying, "No, you got to get this job at the White House." And again, like, some people, like, "Oh, okay, like you're working at Ed, but I thought you like joined the campaign pretty early. Like, you couldn't get a White House job." Like, again, there was this like, oh, again, like working for Arne, right? Like following my passion. Those 5 years at Ed were transformative to my life. The people I met, the relationships I built, the subject matter expertise that I was able to get made it so that when I then 5 years later joined Mrs. Obama at the White House, then I'm Eric Waldo, right? I'm a guy who knows who to call, knows where to go, knows how to navigate an agency, knows the subject matter areas. I'm suddenly more of an operator. And so now suddenly it looks like I've made all these decisions at the turning points. But again, I will just point it out. So I go to work for Michelle Obama, but that was not an assumed thing, right? Again, life's funny at these crossroads. Right before I got the offer to work for Mrs. Obama, I had an offer to go work at Google. And this is early 2014. And, I've been, again, a guy who's mostly worked in nonprofit and government. I hadn't made a lot of money in my life. And I had this job offer at Google. And I was like, I debated it for like a week. And I was like, I feel like I want to work for Michelle Obama. Like, that's a pretty unique thing to do in my life. And everyone was like, "Eric, yeah, it sounds like you want to do that. Like you're a service guy, go for it." But I had this one guy who came into my office. I was on a interagency council with him at the State Department. He was a business guy. And he literally, again, I stopped in his tracks. He's like, "Wait a second, you're going to say no to Google?" He's like, "Are you crazy?" Like, he was a business guy. He's like, "They're going to offer you more money. Like, you've already served. Like, it's time to go take care of yourself." Like, he was trying to help me see this other point of view. But I was like, "No, I want to do this passion." Same deal. Like, if I had not worked for Mrs. Obama, the experiences I had, the work that you and I got to do together on the College Opportunity Summit, the College Opportunity Agenda of President Obama, creating things like signing day, having those moments, that was, again, like betting on my own passion myself. And I just think it looks great in hindsight. It's the point you and I talked, like the line may look straight or you can create a straight line. But at the time, there were these ups and downs of, am I making the right decision? I had a lot of fear about leaving Reach Higher to work for the Surgeon General. Will this undo all of my work? Does it mean that do I have to start at the beginning of the line? But at every time when I've done this, it's given me more, and it's proved to be true, right? I followed my heart, and that's led to me being able to have a position where now I'm the president and CEO of DC's largest scholarship foundation. We were started by the owner of the Washington Post, Don Graham, 25 years ago.
Such a good guy.
Great guy. We've given away tens of millions of dollars to students over decades. Today, we give away over $7.5 million a year to over 1,300 students. We partner with 13 universities. We create a cohort scholarship program akin to Posse, but it's having incredible results for DC students who are first gen, low income. And again, proving that if you bet on young people, if you give them the resources, academic, social, emotional, and financial, they can compete, they can succeed, they can graduate from college, and they can enter the workforce and live the lives that they want to live. So, I'm at a place now where, again, I try to remember to be grateful and be like, Eric, this is actually, you are living the dream. If you know me well, or people who know me, living the dream is one of my little catchphrases. It works for good days and bad days, but I sometimes have to pinch myself and say, like, I get to talk to people like you and talk about education, and like Arne Duncan is someone who like I can call, and I got to see Mrs. Obama at a college signing day here in DC in late April, where I brought my old world and my new world together. I brought Michelle Obama as a surprise speaker to a DC college access program college signing day at Capital One Arena. We announced a moonshot goal for the city where we want to have an 80% six-year college graduation rate by the year 2050. I think I'm taking all these lessons from different moments in my life and making them possible for now my home community, which is DC. And so it's just so fulfilling, and I feel so grateful and lucky. But none of that could have happened without a lot of luck. But also a lot of believing in myself. And again, like getting to work with people like Arne and Michelle Obama and Vivek Murthy and countless other leaders along the way who were willing to give me light, give me water and sunshine, right, to let me succeed and fail.
Well, I think you have clearly, everyone at home who didn't know you before this is like, understands what I meant by the like infectious joy that you bring to your work, and like that you just vibrancy. That's like you and the passion that you have for the work. It's really inspiring. I did want to ask you 2 curveball questions because of what you said. One is, you've mentioned twice now that you were involved in vetting, and I am so curious about, in that experience, because you hadn't done it originally before, I'm wondering if there were questions that you used while vetting that you discovered were actually more insightful about whether someone was a good fit or not. Was there like any question that for you found was more illuminating, or was, for you could kind of give you the substance that you were looking for?
It's a great question. And by the way, vetting is, again, a classic like DC term, but just to be clear of like what vetting is, right? Like vetting at a cabinet level on a transition, like you were truly interviewing and also doing deep research on a candidate to make sure for, again, someone who might be the Secretary of Education, the head of the CIA, the Secretary of Defense, you were basically part of a team of vetters who are traditionally lawyers and maybe a few researchers, and you are all like divvying up their life and saying, hey, Mike, you're going to read books from this time to this time. Nikki, you're going to cover publications here. Eric, you're going to do social media and other things. Brian, you're going to interview this candidate. Here's the 80 questions that the transition team has created. And again, it's all with the mindset, which is we want to make sure we understand risk, which is both is not just is this person qualified, but are there any things that might embarrass the president, the party, or put them in some way at risk of not being able to, be confirmed by the Senate for these Senate confirmed positions. So what I would tell you is that those questions were largely pre-gamed in terms of, hey, here's the list of questions that folks have created to make sure we're all aligned. What I would tell you is that I think what was most interesting from the vetting process is that you saw, and maybe I'm speaking a little bit out of school, but like things that may have been a red flag, like red flags were different based on how senior the role was, right? So if someone was super senior and again, really had the support of the president, maybe something that would have been a red flag for a more junior person didn't count as much. So, we asked a lot of, the tax questions, which again, this is more like Clinton era history of like, did you pay a withholding tax for your housekeeper, for your nanny, for whomever? Maybe at a certain era, that was a red flag. You're gone. I found the more senior the person was, the more likely they were to get more grace versus more junior staff. So again, like maybe not surprising, right? Like, when the 16-year-old with the driver's license does the rolling stop, like the cop's going to pull him over. Maybe someone gets to say, oh, okay, sir, I see, I'm going to give you a warning this time. But I think to me, it was a reminder that you never know what's going to be the thing that could be problematic. And I think in DC, candidates often overthink that there are these simple metrics of, was I on this society? Did I give this donation? It's really actually a multivariable equation. And there are so many people in the room helping to assess that risk. How many, you may be a prolifically published author and academic. You may be the biggest subject matter expert. It still could be problematic. Last thing I'll say on this that I think is what I learned is that there's a big difference between subject matter expertise and management expertise, which maybe is a no-brainer, like obviously, but I felt early on in the administration, we were skewing early on for subject matter expertise, not realizing that if you're the assistant secretary of the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, for example, at Ed, it's great that you may have the knowledge and have written the books, but actually your part of your job, a big part, is going to be managing a team of 100, 200, 300 people. And that piece is something that I saw hurt different candidates along the way, where even if they got in, they thought the job was just about the content, and it became also about managing a large bureaucracy, which is not an intuitive switch, right? So, you're the Nobel Prize X for Y, but have you actually managed a team larger than 5 grad students?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's super interesting. There were so many things. The Don Graham part that you brought up too earlier. He's such a good guy, and I was going to tell you that he's the one person who, when I met him, he was just like very like super excited because when it was around Dream.us, and we were about the work we were doing with Dreamers, or just in terms of how we supported them.
Extraordinary work at the Dream.us, helping Dreamers in college education.
His mom's Catherine Graham, right? Like he's like, and the parties of the Graham family are legends, right? And I knowing my background and how just like I'm from out in the woods of Montana, and I'm just randomly at an event in DC, and he's like, "Oh yeah, come on over. We're having a party tonight." And so I get to invite Tim Rennick, which is like still probably the coolest thing I ever did for Tim Rennick, is I brought him to a Don Graham party, and it was both our first time. We walk in, and like there are members of Congress, there are like CEO. There was like someone from the consulate, like it was the biggest deals, and they're all just walking around like, and Don like invited us to just sit there, and he just like held court and gave a chance for Tim to like talk about student success to like at the time someone who was running for president. It was just like, it was the wildest experience, and since that time I've never been invited to any other parties by anyone. and they would never live up to it, but he's he's just always been so kind. Anyway, Don, lovely.
He's a legend in DC and elsewhere. I think he's been an incredible public servant. He started the DC CAP organization in 1999, recognizing at the time that there were no school counselors in DC high schools, and he wanted to transform college completion in DC. So he put, with his, as the chair of the board, he helped raise money and start a team and a staff that then allowed and made sure that we had a counselor in every high school, then had a small last dollar scholarship for students to go anywhere. We've transitioned in our 25-year history. Now we're a much larger scholarship and more of a completion organization. But his work, his leadership at DC CAP, at Dream.us, helping make sure Dreamers can complete, has been extraordinary. They have a great new CEO in Gabby Pacheco. They're doing phenomenal work. And Don and Arne have a lot of leadership qualities in common, which I really appreciate, of really being just entirely mission focused, all about students. I would also say our new board chair, or newish compared to Don, he's been there for a little less than a decade. Ted Leonsis is my current board chair, a really phenomenal leader in the DC community. Again, when you meet people in the space, Ted's another person. Like Mrs. Obama, he is a first-gen college graduate, right? His parents worked in the service industry. He was born in Brooklyn, moves to Lowell, Massachusetts, starts at a community college, or University of Massachusetts Lowell, and meets a guy. He's mowing his lawn, and as Ted tells it, he like bought a book in the library about mowing lawns, starts knocking on doors to find out if someone will help let him mow their lawn. The guy hires and takes a chance on Ted. Ted impresses them, and he says, "Hey, like, are you going? What's your plan? What are you doing in the fall?" And he says, "You know what? I think you might be Georgetown material." That guy happens to be, I think, on the board of directors at Georgetown. Encourages Ted to apply. Ted transfers to Georgetown. Life transformed, right? Goes from this first-gen kid who thought he couldn't make it to being the guy who's running circles around people at Georgetown with just his suitcase and his bag, showing up on a bus, to New York Avenue. And then Ted, of course, becomes a founder of AOL, and helps transform the early internet. Now owns many sports teams, has his hands in a lot of places, trying to make things better for people, and especially for here in DC. And I'm so grateful for him and so many other philanthropists on my board and elsewhere who are still betting on education. And Bridget, we haven't talked about this, and I think it's important for this weekly wisdom and the people who might be watching. We're living at a time right now where so many people are questioning the value of higher ed, right? Like the pendulum swings every 5 to 10 years. And I think I can't go through a weekend where I maybe don't read something where someone says, is college worth it? Here's the survey of people who think college isn't worth it, or they're giving up. And I just want to say, thank you to everyone who's watching you and supporting you, Mainstay, Carnegie, everybody, because they still understand and believe the numbers. And that's the truth. And I have a slide where I say, is college worth it? It still is, right? It's transformative. And here in DC, we're lucky to have great colleges like Georgetown. Tony Carnevale from the Georgetown Center for Education Workforce recently, who announced he's retiring, he's got this famous study, right, showing the value of college. Now it's up to 1.2 million more versus a high school diploma across the country. He did a state-by-state analysis. Well, guess where college is worth the most? Washington, D.C. $1.9 million is the differential of a college diploma versus a high school diploma in DC, more than all 50 states, because we're a knowledge economy. So this is true in almost every state in our country, maybe with these sort of Alaska, where it's like pretty narrow. The work you do at the Innovation Alliance, the work that everyone who's watching this program does, Doug and everyone at Inside Higher Ed, you're helping shine a spotlight on the fact that college, higher ed still is worth it. I think about disruption coming in AI and other things. We know being a lifelong learner is going to be critical. So I just want to thank you, anyone who's watching or listening or consuming this podcast or this live stream, that the work you're doing on helping make sure we're at the front lines, creating ladders of opportunity for young people is so, so important. Don Graham started that in his whole life. Ted Leonsis has done it. Arne Duncan has done it. Michelle Obama has done it. Everyone I respect and know and care about thinks that this is the work of their lives. And I appreciate you dedicating so much of your life to this work.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm just so excited that you're doing that work and that you're staying committed to spreading this news. But it's also like, as you were talking about that, I just think about, getting our finger on exactly what this issue is. And I think there's a connection between the fact that we have incredible data. We have incredible, compelling story to tell. Goes back to what you said about storytelling. Like, we have an incredible story to tell about the impact of college in people's lives and like the earning outcomes. But our cognitive dissonance and our unwillingness to admit that people come to college to get a job makes it so that it's a hard story for people to trust, I think, or for them to listen to us about if we aren't going to be willing to just sit with both those things being true. We can't expect you to know the $1 million more in your lifetime if I won't admit that the reason that more than 90% of students come to college is to get a job. And I think that is going to be something that we're going to have to wrestle with. And like, we actually have to integrate the nervous system, because we can't, it's definitely connected. I want to just wrap with the best advice that you've received and a book that has been most powerful about leadership that you would recommend, that you most frequently recommend others.
Yeah, on best advice I've received, it's maybe I'll cheat and give more than one, but one of them, I was at this career inflection moment, and there was a job I'd been up for. I didn't get it. I thought I deserved it. I was feeling pretty down about it, and I met with someone who was sort of a peer, and we were having coffee, and she was telling me, always play the long game. And how I interpreted always play the long game is, something may happen. Not every day is going to go your way, but like always, again, show up with your values, your integrity, keep doing the work, and eventually you're going to get there. Maybe you didn't get there today. You lost today's game, but if you're playing the long game, and again, that following your passion, doing what you want, you're going to get there. And I think so many people think about the short game. Like, well, I didn't get what I wanted. I'm giving up. I'm leaving. I didn't get the job. I didn't get the promotion. That meeting didn't go how I wanted. I'm giving up, or I'm throwing that relationship out. I think playing that long game is really critical. And I'd add to that, and it's something that my dad, who I mentioned, he passed away last year. He ran a lab at Case Western Reserve for decades, and was an electrophysiologist, a cardiologist. And one of the rules, he had what he called like Waldo's rules in his lab, and one of them was get found out. And he had this story about when he was more in a training level of his career, he was doing innovative work, and the surgeons basically were like, hey, like, get found out. They meant like, you're doing this work and nobody knows about it. Like, make sure people know what you're doing. And I think I often find people in their careers, if you're like me, maybe you have a moment where you don't really want to self-promote, or it feels gross to like ask for something or say how good you are, even maybe you feel uncomfortable even being on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever, being like saying something about you. And I think that you don't want to over-index on ego, but you also want to make sure it's not a mystery that people, sort of virtue in obscurity is not useful, right? I think you want to make sure people know about you, that you're trying to have a healthy appetite of getting out there and making sure people know what you're passionate about, what you want to do, what you want to be. Because if you share that, if you want to be a college president, you want to be a dean, you want to be a school counselor, you want to be a superintendent, if you let people know what your dreams are, like that will help them know how to help you. And so that's where Get Found Out thing is about, you taking agency to make sure you're not just assuming, like by the grace of the Almighty, that you'll be pulled out of obscurity into the dream job that you want.
It's great advice. He was a great man. Great advice. Everything I've learned about your father, he was just, what a legend. So you are a great testament to him. The leadership book.
So look, two things. I'd say on the book side, and Tim Rennick's getting multiple shout outs on this podcast. There is a book by Andrew Gumbel called Won't Lose This Dream. And it is actually about the work at Georgia State University, and tells the story of how Tim and other leaders, helped create and transform that institution into what it is today, on completion, on technology, on data. But you realize, right, sometimes you hear stories in obscurity and you think it's just this like one person by themselves taking on the world. You realize it took multiple leaders, multiple years, and it was hard, right? It was someone playing the long game on what are all these chess pieces that I have to move to get where I need to get. So Won't Lose This Dream is a book I recommend. And I will just say overall, and for folks who maybe are also thinking about podcasts, I'm just a huge fan of Adam Grant, who is a behavioral psychologist at Penn Wharton. He has a podcast called Work Life, and he is, it's been going on for years now, and he's talking to leaders, CEOs across multiple sectors around what they do to, again, as he says, make work not suck, right? Like how to give feedback, how to think about challenge yourself, how to surround yourself with great folks. And I listen to that almost like my own like mini MBA therapy, where like, if I'm going somewhere on a Thursday, like who's Adam Grant talking to? What CEO lesson is he learning? It's a little bit like what you're doing here, Bridget, by talking to leaders and getting their essences. And again, he's as a PhD in that work area, he'll also say, his on Instagram, on Twitter, he'll post something like, hey, like here's a control trial we did. It's not just my idea, because I'm telling you Eric ideas and they're, anecdotal, which is in the form of data, but he's actually saying, hey, like they tested it and they've learned it and this is a little bit better. Like think about that. It's helpful.
I love it. Those are excellent recommendations. It's been really such a pleasure having you on the show. I feel like people are going to now have a sense of just how wonderful you are. And I feel like you've really given a lot of really good nuggets of leadership and wisdom. And you've spread the impact of the incredible leaders that you've had an opportunity to work closely with. So thank you so much for being our guest today. And for those of you at home, we will see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Bridget. Really appreciate it.